Hi, I'm the Space Quest Historian. Before we get into this video, let me just warn you, this is one of those rambly videos where I just spew a bunch of word vomit over a bunch of game footage. I think the popular term is video essay, so it's not going to be a very visually exciting video, possibly not exciting in the slightest. So if that's not your thing, then just go ahead and skip this video, I won't blame you. Anyway, this may come as a surprise, but games don't always have to be meaty chunks of time killers with upgrade trees and side quests and lore dumps the size of Victor Hugo novels, or padded out with mazes and obtuse logic puzzles or stealth or action sequences to arbitrarily extend their playtime. I like walking simulators. I like a game that puts story first and gameplay second. Gone Home and What Remains of Edith Finch are two shining examples of how games can engross you in a story without bogging you down with ludicrous puzzles or unnecessarily tacked on game mechanics. And I recently played through another one called The Station, which I very much enjoyed. And while we've come a long way in terms of legitimizing various genres of gaming without resorting to pejorative terms, we're by no means there yet. Mobile games continue to be regarded as a lesser life form, and while most of them are indeed ad-infested pay-to-win assembly line knockoffs of each other, only the smoothest of smooth gamer brains would seriously describe the casual gaming genre as not games at all. Meanwhile, the term walking simulator started as a deliberately pejorative term that then ended up being used to describe a certain subgenre of adventure games. A more accurate description would really just be something like adventure game light, since the negative term walking simulator basically just means that it's an adventure game that's very light on puzzles, to the point where most people seem to think that you can finish the game by just walking around the game world until the game solves itself. And that really isn't true though. Gone Home and Edith Finch do have puzzles to solve, even if they are very simple compared to the cerebral cock blocks of your traditional point-and-click adventure games. Even a game like The Stanley Parable, which uses walking as the primary means of interaction, still requires the player to actively search out various hidden areas or circumventing the game's proposed linear path to uncover a myriad of quote-unquote secret endings, and some of them do require the player to physically interact with the game world, even if that interaction just amounts to pushing a few buttons in a control room, or a single button to prevent a cardboard baby from incinerating itself. Look, it's a fucking weird game, and I love it. Its follow-up game, The Beginner's Guide, is even more interesting in this regard. It doesn't have a burning baby, but it's interesting nonetheless in the way you interact with it. The game serves as a sort of meta-commentary on the art of game development itself by having you literally walk from one unfinished game prototype to the next, while a disembodied narrator meditates on the nature of game mechanics as expressions of the game designer's mental state, rather than a desire to appeal to an audience. In fact, the core hook of the game is that the individual games you explore were not meant for public consumption at all. They were just creative expressions by a friend of the narrator who never intended for these games to ever see the light of day, a trust that the narrator has then violated by actually releasing these games anyway. The game is a sort of meditation on using the medium of computer games as something more than just a pastime, and what little it has to offer in terms of actual gameplay elements are just there to illustrate the point. You can't fail at this game, you just sort of go through it and listen to this guy have a nervous breakdown about what actually constitutes a game. Computer and video games, by their very nature, always have an element of interaction, however inconsequential they may be. They're not passive forms of entertainment like books or TV shows or movies, but here's the thing. By defining anything as a game, we ascribe it certain unspoken characteristics. We expect there to be rules, rewards, and challenges. For a game to live up to its role as a game, it needs to have elements that the player can manipulate that either result in you winning or losing. We're conditioned to believe that the obstacles you face on your path towards winning the game have to be challenging enough to not be boring, but also balanced enough so it feels rewarding instead of grueling. When speaking of video or computer games, there's no strict hardline definition of what constitutes good gameplay. For some, absurd levels of difficulty feels rewarding because it gives them the feeling of rising to an occasion that to others seem insurmountable. These are typically the sort of insufferably smug fucksticks who will repeatedly tell other people to get good. Story and immersion are a distant second to the steady supply of endorphins released by the knowledge that they are good at something others aren't. I mean, I got a comment on my video about why the gameplay was a detriment to the story in Stray that said, "Skill issue." Fuck you, buddy. Way to miss the point. Because there are people who enjoy a different type of game, one where narrative and world building are the predominant attractions that must not be unnecessarily interfered with by the game's mechanics. A challenging obstacle may be welcomed, but it shouldn't take away from the core experience of the story. Now, this is obviously a grossly simplified view of the spectrum of gameplay, and realistically most games lie somewhere in between. But what I'm getting at here is, for all the pointless debates about whether a game is challenging enough or how many hours it takes to beat or whether the auto-aiming sucks or the AI AI is too dumb, or even the peak of stupidity, which is the question, is this even a game, which is a knee-jerk accusation often levied at casual and mobile games, typically by the aforementioned good knuckleheads. We're still talking about video and computer games as games. Games with rules, games with challenges and rewards, games with winners and losers. But honestly, I think that's selling the potential of computer games short. It's why the discussion about whether games are art has had such an uphill battle, because if you ask someone who doesn't play games, someone who has a very classic, or dare I say conservative definition of what art is supposed to be, they'll tell you that games are not art, they're toys. They're wrong, of course, but honestly, taking a step back, you can kind of see where they're coming from. Games, by a very traditional and archaic definition, are something that children play. Adults don't play games, they do their taxes, and they indulge in a bit of entertainment to unwind once they're done doing adulty stuff. And this is a horribly degrading way of looking at games as an art form, because of course games are art. They're just as much a legitimate art form as books, TV shows, movies, music, paintings, sculptures, and a toilet urinal at an art gallery. The only people who would argue against computer games being an art form are people who don't understand what computer games are. But it's because we've chosen to label them as games that people are still even having this fucking discussion in the first place. But at this point, we've come so far from the days of arcade cabinets and Atari home consoles that I think we need to start reconsidering some things. Some games are still games. In fact, it's probably fair to say that most of them are, and this is not to say that there are lesser forms of entertainment, don't get me wrong, but some games, in my opinion, fall outside the definition of games. Unfortunately, we apply the same reductionist approach to experiencing games as we do to movies and books and other forms of art. We watch a movie, we read a book, we look at art. Bullshit. That's just the physical way we interact with the medium. The true value of any sort of creative work, and I mean any work, books, movies, paintings, sculptures, architecture, toilets, finger painting, graffiti, collages, theater, photography, music, and making dumb YouTube videos like this one, is not just in the practical way you consume it, but more importantly in the way you experience it and what impression it leaves you with. I don't know what word you could substitute for game in the cases where an interactive piece of entertainment defies the definition of what a game is. Sure, we've got the phrase interactive entertainment, but it doesn't exactly roll off the fucking tongue, does it? And calling them experiences just sounds fucking pretentious, so that's a no-go too. I just think at this point we need to stop referring to any non-spreadsheety computer activity as games, because I think it does a huge disservice to the medium of interactive storytelling. I personally hate calling myself a gamer, even though I play a shit ton of games, because to a lot of people the phrase gamer instantly brings to mind that tired stereotype of a 14-year-old maladjusted dweeb in his bedroom yelling at other maladjusted adolescents over a headset. Every time I've been asked by someone who doesn't play computer games, like a work colleague or some distant family relative at a Christmas party or whatever, what my YouTube channel is about, I can't help but roll my eyes at myself and say, oh, it's about computer games. It's not like I'm embarrassed or anything, I just don't have the time or energy to explain to them that it's probably not the sort of games they're thinking of, and there's a very high probability that they wouldn't care anyway. To them, it's not even about what kind of computer games they are. If I said, oh, I'm a film buff, or I have a food channel where I cook parts of my own body and feed them to neighborhood children, then at least I'd have their interest piqued. But saying, oh, it's about computer games is almost always a surefire way to get a response in turn along the lines of, oh, I don't understand anything about that. And I'm like, bullshit, I'm sure you used to play games when you were a kid. You just called it tag instead of deathmatch. And furthermore, we were playing Ludo just a minute ago. That's a game, right? And I'm pretty damn sure you've seen a computer keyboard and a mouse at some point in your life, and they're not that fucking hard to operate. Certainly not any harder than your hobby that you mentioned a while ago. What was it? Restoring 1950s drag race cars and fashioning spare parts from discarded kitchen appliances? That sounds like it takes fucking skill. Clicking your mouse on a hotspot doesn't take any fucking skill, but it might, I don't know, resonate emotionally with you or something. Maybe that's worth considering at least. But no, the phrase computer games is just an instant turnoff, because as much as we would like to bullshit ourselves into thinking otherwise, that aforementioned tired stereotype is still alive and well. I don't need to tell you the benefits of playing computer games. They build and strengthen anything from hand-eye coordination to logical thinking to strategic planning, hell, even social skills. I mean, those 14-year-olds do grow up eventually. But I think it's time we started differentiating between games and interactive stories. And again, I'm not implying that one is better than the other, it's simply a branding issue. Maybe if we start calling them something else, it will convince developers that there's nothing wrong with making quote-unquote games that don't really have any gameplay, that they don't need to include puzzles or action sequences or fucking stealth sections to keep players engaged. Because a well-told story is engaging enough on its own. You don't need to shoehorn shit in out of fear that it won't appeal to gamers, and maybe people like the aforementioned skill issue jackass will stop missing the point. I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking this shit. I'm not gonna say leave a comment down below, because I didn't make this video to beg for comments or farm engagement or spark a fucking debate or whatever. The irony here is that the intended audience for this video aren't gonna watch it anyway. I know that whoever's watching this has one of two opinions right now. Either they agree with me, or they will tell me to get my head out of my ass and stop being such a pretentious dipshit. And both of those opinions are fair. The latter one perhaps even more so than the first. This is just something I've been thinking about for a very, very long time, and ever since playing through The Station, and also recently picking up What Remains of Edith Finch and replaying that for a second time, it rekindled those thoughts, and I just felt like shooting that off into the void so I could at least get it off my chest, and now I have. So, I'll see you around the Chrono Stream and all that. Bye-bye.